This program is presented and distributed by Keep the Faith on the web at www.keepthefaith.org.
Yes. Well, today, the first talk I'm going to give you today is called Vatican II, the Protestant Connection. And when the Pope decided to summon a council, he actually sent out this letter. I'll just read you a few extracts from it. We, on the occasion of the coming council, cannot refrain from addressing our apostolic and paternal words to all who acknowledge the same Jesus Christ as Redeemer, and who glory in the Christian name, but who do not profess the true faith of Christ, or follow the communion of the Catholic Church. We do this so that in all zeal and charity we may strongly advise, exhort and beseech them to consider seriously and to take heed whether or not they are following the road prescribed by Christ the Lord, which leads to eternal salvation. Let each one ponder and meditate carefully about the condition of the various religious groups that disagree among themselves, and that are separated from the Catholic Church, which, without intermission since the time of Christ the Lord and his apostles, has always exercised through his legitimate sacred shepherds, and still exercises at the present time the divine power transmitted to her by the Lord himself. If he does so, he must easily persuade himself that no single one of these groups, or all of them together, constitute and are in any manner that one Catholic Church which Christ the Lord erected, established and willed, and that these groups can in no way be called members or parts of the same church as long as they are visibly separated from Catholic unity. For groups of this kind lack that living authority established by God, which teaches men about matters of faith and morals, especially, and guides them in all that pertains to eternal salvation. May all those, therefore, who do not hold the unity and truth of the Catholic Church welcome the occasion of this council, in which the Catholic Church, to which their ancestors belonged, exhibits new proof of her intimate unity and of her impregnable strength. In response to the needs of their hearts, may they also be able to escape from a state in which they cannot be sure of their salvation. And may they not cease to pray fervently to the Lord of mercies that he may tear down the wall of separation, dispel the darkness of errors, and lead them back to the bosom of Holy Mother Church, in which their ancestors possessed the salutary pastures of life, and in which alone the teaching of Christ Jesus is preserved and transmitted whole and entire, and the mysteries of heavenly grace are dispensed. I think you'll all agree that's pretty impressive, except the date of it was given in Rome and St. Peter's on the 13th day of September 1868. Yes, it's the papal, it was his letter, apostolic letter Iam Vos Omnes, which he sent to the Protestants of the world. But I'm afraid nothing like that came out from the Pope before, during or after Vatican II, inviting Protestants to abandon their errors. And the reason is that a key aim of the European avant-garde, probably obsession actually would be a better word than aim, was to replace the true Catholic concept of ecumenism as laid down by Pope Pius IX in that letter I've just read you extracts from, Iam Vos Omnes. They wanted to replace it with a policy of unity at any price. The key country in which you find this avant-garde was, of course, Germany, and a very, very well-known English Catholic priest, Father Francis Ripley, some of you might have heard of, used to write wonderful booklets for the Catholic Truth Society. He wrote a letter to the tablet, and he explained what was going on in Germany. He says, the desire now manifest in Germany to present the Catholic mysteries in terms traditionally associated with Protestantism. Many visitors to Germany recently have been shocked by certain elements of the new approach. An eminent Australian asked a parish priest how he encouraged his people to visit the Blessed Sacrament, since he had removed it from the high altar to an obscure side chapel. I don't, the priest replied. All who have spoken to me after visits to Germany have been, to express it very mildly, disturbed by what they saw there. As another priest put it, they're talking about sweeping away useless accretions to the liturgy, but they are in reality attacking perfectly legitimate developments which have meant much to the piety of the faithful. Pius XII warned against this very thing in Mediator Dei. Yet another visitor, an American priest, summed up his impression of Catholic scholarship in Germany like this: "I guess they're waging a total war against tradition." Nor is this confined to the liturgy, Father Ripley continues. Some speak of the tragic definition of the Assumption, which came perilously near to bringing the death blow to the ecumenical movement. Others want us to drop references to tradition as a source of revelation, and alongside all this is a calculated refusal to make individual converts on the excuse that conversion work will impede progress towards unity. Again, a practical reversal of the policy of the Church since apostolic times. Now, it's very important to notice that Father Ripley wrote this letter in 1962. It wasn't written with the benefit of hindsight, and it is hardly necessary to point out to you the extent to which the situation he reported was found in Germany in 1962 has spread throughout the West since the Council, and practices which the Church previously condemned as aberrations in 1962 are now the norm. Cardinal Heenan of Westminster, England, has explained how completely unaware the British and American bishops were of the extent to which so many of their European counterparts had been infected by what he later termed ecumenia. Cardinal Heenan writes, "We did not know what the Dutch were thinking, and were quite unprepared for the later discovery that some Dutch Catholics had made almost a religion of ecumenism. Impatient of any dogmatic differences, they are ready to barter any doctrine in the cause of external unity. When the Secretariat for Christian Unity was first set up, there were not less than 4 members from Holland. This did not seem significant at the time, because the rest of the Church was unaware of the vast religious change in Holland since the war." I remember John saying to me the other day, he was reading something by some European theologians, and they said since Auschwitz, Thomism is completely irrelevant. Everything we did before Auschwitz is now all irrelevant. It means nothing. A good number of the Council Fathers and the Periti succumbed very quickly to this disease of ecumenia, which could be defined as a state of mind in which the prime criterion for explaining any aspect of church teaching is not whether it is true, but whether it is ecumenical. Those with this ecumenical obsession were sufficiently powerful to adapt the official documents of the Council to this standpoint, sometimes by ambiguity, but more often by a change of emphasis. The true Catholic position can usually be found by those who look hard enough, but is sometimes phrased in such muted tones that Protestant commentators have been able to give a number of the documents a most enthusiastic welcome. Before examining the influence of Protestantism upon the Council, it will be useful to take a look at the nature of contemporary Protestantism. The first and most obvious point to make is that it is not really possible to make any generalized statements about the positive aspects of Protestantism, that is to say, common beliefs and common practices. The history of Protestantism is one of division, fragmentation and conflict, a fragmentation into 70,000 distinct communions. As is normally the case with sects when they begin to subdivide, their internal disputes become even fiercer than their opposition to the body from which they have broken away. Calvinism expanded not primarily at the expense of Catholics, but of Lutherans in North Germany, and the name Reformed first came into common use when opposed not to Catholics, but to Lutherans. Before 1570, some stricter Lutherans had even begun to profess that Catholicism was nearer to orthodoxy than Calvinism. The process of Protestant fragmentation doesn't even stop here. For within each Protestant denomination, each individual is his own pope in the final analysis. The heretical concept of justification by faith alone, devised by Luther, dispensed with the need for any divinely founded church, mediating the grace of God to man, and able to teach with authority. An infallible magisterium was replaced with an infallible book, the Bible. But even an infallible book needs an interpreter, and the inescapable logic of Protestantism is that no individual has the authority to impose his interpretation on anyone else. Father Louis Bouillet recounts that the Princess of the Palatinate once described Protestantism to Louis XIV with this formula: "In our country, everyone makes up his own little religion." Luther replaced the infallible teaching authority of the Church by his self-bestowed personal infallibility in interpreting the Bible. In theory, he conceded the right of every believer to do this. In matters of faith, he said, each Christian is for himself Pope and Church. But in practice, it was Luther's interpretation which must be accepted. He who does not accept my doctrine cannot be saved, for it is God's, not mine. Luther most certainly did not believe in universal freedom of opinion in religious matters. What he demanded was freedom for his own opinions. Those who disagreed with him, whether Catholic or Protestant, were dismissed as pig dogs, dolts, donkeys, fiends from hell. His interpretation of the Bible was the saving truth. All else was lies and delusions. It's hardly surprising that some reformers who disagreed with him remarked sardonically that it was small gain to have got rid of the Pope of Rome if they were to have in his place the Pope of Wittenberg. A logical consequence of Protestantism is that if each believer is free to make his own reason the ultimate arbiter of truth, then Protestantism must inevitably move towards rationalism. Pope St. Pius X warns in his encyclical Pascendi, by how many roads modernism leads to atheism. The error of Protestantism, he said, made the first step on this path. That of modernism makes the second. Atheism makes the next. The often impressive structures of the major Protestant bodies are in reality no more than facades, behind which there exists a series of ill-defined systems undergoing an inexorable process of mutation into rationalism. It is clear that the ecumenical movement as it now exists is based on the completely false premise that organic unity with Protestants can be achieved by ecumenical negotiations. Such a belief is the most illusory form of utopianism imaginable, and unfortunately its most fervent advocate is Pope John Paul II. And let anyone who doubts this just subscribe to the Osservatore Romano for a year and start reading his allocutions. The more those in authority try to bring the Church closer to Protestantism, then, the closer they bring it to religionless Christianity. To quote Father Bouillet again, Catholics today endlessly drag themselves along on their bellies before the more or less cloven hoofs of all the golden calves with which their progress teems. But what is really extraordinary is that, while at their horizons, they do not hear the enormous burst of laughter gradually growing in the world at the spectacle presented by their maniacal servility. Actually, people stopped taking them seriously long ago. But what else would you want them to do at a sudden and unexpected crawling on all fours by people who turn their backs on you for generations, but hold their sides? Yet there are more sensitive people in the world, and more than Catholics imagine, who are not only not carried away by all this mouldy incense taken from God for the sole benefit of their nostrils, but who find the stench of this abject humility nauseating. Christians of all denominations are now devoting themselves to the construction of an earthly paradise with the zeal that their predecessors displayed in propagating the gospel. And in this endeavour, they are happy to collaborate with men of any belief or none, providing that they accept that all the problems of the world can be solved by a redistribution of wealth and a drastic reduction in the birth rate. When I mentioned earlier that it was not possible to make generalized statements about the common beliefs and common practices of Protestantism, I was not referring simply to the differences between the sects, but to their internal differences. The denomination that has most preoccupied the conciliar popes is Anglicanism. It would be very hard to find any particular doctrine and state that it represents Anglican belief. All that can be done is to state that it represents the belief of some Anglicans. Monsignor Dwyer, the Catholic Bishop of Birmingham, remarked in a speech during the council debate on ecumenism, "It is a great mistake to imagine that Catholic and non-Catholic Christians always, or even usually, are in agreement about fundamental doctrines. In fact, we are very far apart on many matters of faith and morals. For instance, you can never be sure that the non-Catholic with whom you are speaking, even if he is a bishop, believes in the virgin birth of Christ, or his bodily resurrection from the dead. What is more, even our separated brethren who are sound on these matters and really hold the doctrine of the true faith are still unwilling to say that those who deny these fundamental doctrines are denying the Christian faith." More or less what you can say about our own church today, unfortunately. Yes, there used to be a time when we could laugh at Anglicans, but we can't really laugh at them anymore. Now, I've got a letter actually from an Anglican bishop which illustrates this problem very well. As I'm saying, I'm quite embarrassed reading it out, and it didn't strike me when I wrote it. You could say this about the Catholic Church today. An Anglican lady wrote to him and asked, what exactly does the Church of England teach about the Eucharist? And this is what the bishop said. The doctrine of the Church of England on the Holy Communion has been expounded in 4 or 5 different ways. The truth of the matter is that the Church of England is not at all anxious to be too explicit, and in this great wisdom is shown. The Church of England has been satisfied to state first that transubstantiation is not true, and secondly that Christ does give himself as our spiritual food. Further than that, there are no definitions. How can anybody define exactly the way in which Christ comes to his people in Holy Communion? Who knows? This is good. Who knows and who has the right to dogmatize? Well, the Reverend Gentleman is absolutely correct in this final question. Who within the worldwide Anglican Communion has the right to dogmatize? The answer is no one. Certainly not the so-called Archbishop of Canterbury, who has no more authority within the Church of England than the chairman of a board of directors. The farcical situation within Anglicanism during the 19th century, when hardly any 2 adjacent pulpits proclaimed the same doctrine, has now passed so far beyond the level of farce that I can't really find a word to describe it. Now, we all know, of course, that the Anglican clergy do not have valid orders, and hence they don't have a valid Eucharist. But we'll leave that aside for a moment and try to get inside of the minds of thousands of Anglican clergy who imagine that they do have valid orders and can consecrate validly, just as our own priests do. These men also insist that women cannot be ordained. And as women cannot be ordained, the Eucharist celebrated by the Anglican priestesses are invalid. Now, all Anglicans, they're free to believe women have valid orders when they're ordained, or they're free to believe that they don't. And the priest in one parish thinks his lady colleague in the next is just as much a priest as he is, which of course isn't a priest at all. But then another priest can believe that this is just a laywoman dressing up in priest's vestments, conducting a parody of the Anglican communion service. Yet thousands of such clergy are content to remain Anglicans. There was talk of thousands of them coming to join the Catholic Church in England when the Church of England started ordaining women, but it just ended up with a couple dozen. I had a friend of mine, the historian Hugh Ross Williamson, who himself left the Church of England, and he said the Anglo-Catholics have a perpetually receding crunch point. They say if this happens, we all go over to Rome. Then they'll find an excuse. And the next thing, if this happens, we'll all go over to Rome. So you get Dr. Carey, who's the current layman, styling himself Archbishop of Canterbury. He believes fervently in the validity of female ordination, just of course as he believes in the validity of his own illusory ordination. And he considers anyone who says women can't be ordained as a heretic. But, you see, here's this farcical situation. No Anglican is obliged to accept Dr. Carey's opinion. And the Anglicans have now, in the latest negotiations with this Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission, they've graciously agreed that in the event of unity between Catholics and Anglicans, the Pope can have the same authority in the new united body that Dr. Carey has in the Anglican Communion, which of course is no authority at all. So I think that's hardly an offer that the Pope can't refuse. There are also very important differences in moral teaching. The Anglican bishops are not opposed to abortion in principle. Some of them think you shouldn't be able to get abortion on demand. But I don't think there's one Anglican bishop who's opposed to abortion on principle. And their attitude to contraception is impossible to reconcile with the official Catholic position. Though, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, unofficially, some Catholic bishops and even whole hierarchies have adopted the Anglican standpoint in practice. In other words, that everyone has a right to make his own decision. The only Catholic and practical form of ecumenism is to explain the faith courteously and clearly to Protestants as individuals, doing everything possible to clear away any misconceptions without compromising the truth. What the Church teaches is true, and it follows that where Protestants reject Catholic teaching, they are rejecting the truth, however sincere they may be in their beliefs. No one is more injured by the policy of Catholic ecumenists in obscuring the truth to please Protestants than are Protestants themselves. If they are given the impression that one religion is as good as another, they're unlikely to abandon their errors and accept the invitation given to them by Pope Pius IX in Iam Vos Omnes, which I quoted to you earlier. Any form of ecumenism which does not base itself upon this invitation is a betrayal of the Catholic faith. In his encyclical Mortalium Animos, Pope Pius XI issued an identical invitation to that of Pope Pius IX. Let these separated children return to the apostolic see established in the city which the princes of the apostles, Peter and Paul, consecrated with their blood, to this see, the root and matrix of the Catholic Church, not indeed with the hope that the Church of the living God, the pillar and ground of truth, will abandon the integrity of the faith and bear their errors, but to subject themselves to its teaching authority and rule. The 450th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation was celebrated in Wittenberg on the 31st of October 1967. A number of Catholic representatives joined 1,000 Protestant delegates from all over the world to pay tribute to Martin Luther. A personal representative of Cardinal Baer found it difficult to hold a continuous conversation, so frequently must he shake another evangelical hand. One of the Lutheran observers at Vatican II, Dr. K.E. Skeidsgaard, spoke of the manner in which the Second Vatican Council seemed in many ways to have brought the Catholic Church very close to the Protestant churches. Archdeacon Pauli, an Anglican observer, finds that the dialogue envisaged by the decree on ecumenism and encouraged by Pope Paul VI has exceeded the wildest hopes entertained for it. He remarks with great satisfaction, the true picture of the Council was that it represented a powerful victory of the forces of renewal in the Church of Rome over the conservative immobilism of its central government. Professor George Lindbeck of the Yale Divinity School, another Lutheran observer at the Council, was happy to note that the Council marked the end of the Counter-Reformation, and he expressed his satisfaction that the rejection of the proposed schema on the sources of revelation, as well as the results of the discussion on the liturgy. Catholic traditionalists must concur, however regretfully, that the Council certainly did mark the end of the Counter-Reformation. The Counter-Reformation initiated what is probably the greatest era of true renewal in the history of the Church. Every true renewal has one common characteristic: the emergence of great saints. The Counter-Reformation was replete with such great saints as Pius V, Charles Borromeo, Ignatius Loyola, Francis Borgia, Philip Neri, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Robert Bellarmine, Peter Canisius, Aloysius Gonzaga, Stanislas Kostka, Francis Xavier, Francis of Solano, Vincent de Paul, Peter Claver, John of God. One could go on. But one thing all these saints had in common, besides their love of God and their neighbour, was their devotion to the Church. For them, it was only in and through the Church that they could find God and serve their neighbour. Where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? Asked the poet Keats. Where, one might ask, are the fruits of Vatican II? Where are the saints of Vatican II? Well, there's Mother Teresa of Calcutta, but she was a saint before Vatican II, not as a result of it. I absolutely can't think of anyone in the world now you could say is a saint inspired specifically by the teaching of the Second Vatican Council. But there are a lot of people who think that this new relationship with Protestants, now they're all good chums, is itself a wonderful fruit of the Council. But others among us would consider the fact that those who reject Catholic truth find the teaching of the Council more satisfactory than any previous presentation of the faith is a cause for serious concern. I think I've said sufficient now to make it clear that mainstream Protestants found the Council very much to their taste. This is hardly surprising in view of the extent to which they influenced its proceedings. That Protestant influence upon the Council would be considerable was made a certainty when the Secretariat for the Promotion of Christian Unity was established on the 5th of June 1960. It is now one of the most powerful forces in the Vatican. Its purpose was to establish relations with Christian bodies outside the unity of the Church and invite them to send representatives to the Council. The very presence of Protestant observers at the Council was bound to have an inhibiting effect upon the debates. No good-mannered host would wish to express opinions which might offend a guest in his house, if he could help doing so. It is obvious that the presence of these Protestant observers, with whom the Council Fathers mixed freely, and with whom many established friendly relations, must certainly have resulted in some fathers passing over in silence aspects of the faith which might cause offence to their Protestant guests. Archbishop Lefebvre complained that, thus, on those points of specifically Catholic doctrine, one is forced to compose schemas which attenuate or even completely banish anything which could displease the Orthodox and, above all, the Protestants. As is so often the case, Monsignor Lefebvre's judgment is confirmed by someone speaking from the opposite standpoint. Dr. Moorman, a leader of the Anglican delegation, noted that the observers were providing a check on what was being said, and I quote him, "Every bishop who has stood up to speak has known that, in the tribune of St. Longinus, was a group of intelligent and critical people, their pencils and biros poised to take down what he said, and possibly use it in evidence against him and his colleagues on some future occasion. Members of the council tended therefore to be very sensitive to what the representatives of these other communions were thinking, and did their best to avoid saying anything which was likely to cause offence. If some father forgot himself and said things which were bound to cause a flutter in the observer's tribune, he was rebuked sometimes by a later speaker." Protestant influence did not only consist of this inhibiting effect upon what the fathers said, they were sometimes also able to have their own views put forward in the debates. Dr. Moorman again reveals, although the observers were not allowed to speak in the council, their speeches were sometimes made for them by one or other of the council fathers. So people like Dr. Moorman would write a speech and a Catholic bishop would read it for them. The observers were also able to make their views known in weekly meetings of the Unity Secretariat. Dr. McAfee Brown, an American Protestant observer, testifies that frequent changes in the wording or the tone of the final documents can be traced to these briefing sessions. Professor Oscar Kuhlman, a Lutheran delegate, remarked after only 6 weeks, "I am more amazed every morning at the way we really form part of the council." The very close relationship between the observers and the liberal Pariti was disclosed by Father Skillerbeeks when he remarked, "One is astonished to find oneself more in sympathy with the thinking of the Christian, non-Catholic observers than with the views of one's own brethren on the other side of the dividing line. The accusation of connivance with the Reformation is therefore not without foundation." Well, I think most of us would find that our own bishops would have a lot more sympathy with Protestants than anyone who wanted to have the traditional Mass. However sincere the motives behind this misguided policy of appeasement may be, its fruits are now available for us all to see. Our Lord gave one task and one task only to his church. This was to evangelize the world. Go forth and teach all nations. The most manifest result of the council has been the replacement of evangelization by dialogue. There is now little effort to convert anyone to Catholicism, be they pagans, members of some non-Christian monotheistic religion, Protestants, or even Marxists. At every level, from the Vatican to the smallest parish, there is an obsessive preoccupation among the progressive elite to dialogue with anyone and everyone about anything and everything for any length of time. The council was the catalyst which enabled the bishops in a state of euphoria to replace the daunting task of evangelization by endless, fruitless, but very satisfying dialogue. The Catholic Church has not come any nearer to organic unity with any Protestant body than was the case before the council. And in some instances, such as Anglicanism, any hope of unity that existed before the council has now vanished following its decision to ordain women. But nonetheless, the dialogue continues with the enthusiastic approbation of the Pope. Before Vatican II, the Church was engaged in evangelization. Now it talks about it. In 1974, the bishops of the world held a synod on this subject. Their meeting produced a plethora of words, but it is extremely unlikely that a single soul was won from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of light as a result of their very tedious and very expensive deliberations. Much of what they said was printed and distributed at every level throughout the church, so that the faithful could discuss the discussions of their bishops, while throughout the world millions of the faithful abandon the church each year, often as a result of evangelization by Protestant missionaries. I've been told that in the United States since Vatican II, something like 7 million Hispanics have been converted to Protestant sects. I hope that's a very, very great exaggeration. But certainly, I've noticed whenever I've been in the United States, you see little Hispanic chapels. In Brazil, which has the world's largest Catholic population, there are now more worshippers in Protestant chapels each Sunday than there are at Catholic masses. In an analysis of the working paper which the bishops of England and Wales were to use as their basis of their contribution to this synod and evangelization, Father Paul Crane, S.J., who used to be editor of Christian Order, wrote this. What amazed me then, as I read and reread my way through this official working paper, was that its author appeared so utterly aware of this essential fact, that the Church is so busy tearing herself to pieces as to make effective evangelization a near impossibility, that her troubles are from within herself, and that she must get herself right, give herself back the truth, before she can give it to others. What is this madness which causes those occupying responsible posts in the Church persistently to turn a blind eye to the disease which is gripping its vitals, or victuals? Do they think you can get rid of an illness by ignoring its existence? That fatuous optimism is any kind of substitute for a cowardly unwillingness to face the truth, however unpleasant it may be? Evangelization can no more be carried out in these circumstances than you can expect a sick man to get up from his bed and run 100 yards in record time. The other Jesuits in London, they used to call him poor old Paul. And most of them have got married now, but the most obvious result of Vatican II is what Father Brian Houghton, I know a lot of Americans have heard of Father Brian Houghton, he wrote a book, Mitre and Crook. And I remember he says one of the problems is that the first thing they do when someone's made a bishop, he has an operation and they remove his backbone. But he said you can now describe the Catholic Church as the talking church. To a very large extent, as I've been saying, her leaders have substituted ecumenism for evangelization as their first priority, particularly in Western countries. And a vast new ecumenical bureaucracy has come into being. There are countless commissions, conferences, publications and courses concerning ecumenism. Those who immerse themselves in it can make it a full-time occupation without the slightest difficulty. In contrast with the daunting task of evangelization, especially among the de-Christianized masses who form the majority in most Western countries, the effort put into ecumenism is never without the immediate and tangible reward of becoming more and more chummy with Protestant friends. Ecumenists on the Catholic and Protestant sides are infected by an ostrich syndrome. Their endless talks take place with their heads buried deeply in ecumenical sand, which is guaranteed to insulate them from the truth that out in the real world, churches of all denominations are emptying at a terrifying rate, with the exception of the fundamentalist Protestant sects who refuse to take part in the ecumenical movement and are constantly converting millions of members from all the mainstream Christian denominations. It's an inescapable fact in the Western countries that the more progress made by ecumenists, the fewer the number of mainstream Christians offering to worship to God each Sunday. But this causes ecumenists no concern at all. The justification for and satisfaction in ecumenical activity derives from the very fact that it's taking place. It's a self-perpetuating organism, giving the impression of constant and escalating progress. One conference leads to another. National committees mutate into international committees. There's now an ecumenical jet set with privileged members who meet each other in one exotic setting after another. This is particularly true of the Joint Catholic-Anglican International Committee responsible for the notorious agreed statements on the Eucharist ministry and authority. Cardinal Heenan wrote this early in 1966. He says, there is a fraternity of international conference speakers who appear on both sides of the Atlantic at meetings of every theological complexion. There is no little danger that the multiplication of conferences will lead to a neglect of pastoral action. If too much time is spent on speculation, there will be less spent in preaching the Word of God. That, incidentally, said Cardinal Heenan, is one of the dangers of ecumenism. We can become so engrossed in discussing each other's theology that the flocks committed to our care, feeling unwanted, may begin to disperse. These were truly prophetic words, and as ecumenical initiatives proliferate, the pace of the dispersal accelerates. Ecumenism, ecumenia, to give it a more accurate name, is truly the sickness of the church today. Well, what might have seemed to have been a digression from the subject of the Protestant influence on Vatican II is actually very relevant to the theme of this lecture. No reasonable person could deny, as I've just said, that the disease of ecumenia has spread throughout the entire organism of the mystical body as a direct result of the presence of Protestant observers at the Second Vatican Council, even though the symptoms were there long before, lying dormant, waiting for the right conditions to enable the virus to activate itself and then proliferate. The symptoms of the disease were accurately diagnosed in a series of papal statements from Pascendi Gregis of St. Pius X through Mortalium Animos of Pius XI to Humani Generis of Pius XII. I expect you've noticed how all the really great popes we've had in the last centuries have always been called Pius. Thus, though their influence on the course of the Council and the wording of its documents was considerable, the impact of the Protestant observers was most manifest in setting into motion a movement which no group or individual within the Church seems willing or able to stop. I was just reading the Observatory Romano a few weeks ago, and there's a huge allocution by Pope John Paul II, who says no one can consider himself a Catholic today unless he's devoted to ecumenism. In 10 short years, this is what an Anglican observer, Archdeacon Pauli, wrote in 1974. In 10 short years, the Council has taken on the dimension of a world revolution. Archdeacon Pauli finds this a cause for particularly great rejoicing in view of the pessimism felt by Protestant ecumenists during the pontificate of Pius XII. The dogma of the Assumption, and the encyclical Humani Generis in particular, had given rise to great despondency among Protestants. Pauli claims, and I don't think any reasonable person could deny this, that the movement given such impetus by Vatican II in its general trend is irreversible. The most dramatic manifestation for ordinary Catholics is the Protestantization of our liturgy. This too has won great praise from Protestants. And as is so often the case, Archbishop Lefebvre has assessed the situation perfectly. He says, with reference to the changes in the liturgy, all these changes have but one justification: an aberrant, senseless ecumenism that will not attract a single Protestant to the faith, but will cause countless Catholics to lose it, and will instill total confusion in the minds of many more who will no longer know what is true and what is false. Needless to say, we all have a duty to uphold the true Catholic principles of ecumenism as set out in the documents of the three popes I mentioned a few minutes ago. It is dishonest to dissemble, wrote Cardinal Heenan, who insisted that the ultimate object of ecumenism is reunion of all Christians under the Vicar of Christ. The full extent of the debacle of Vatican II lies in the fact that far from thinking of entering Catholic unity, Protestant leaders are now confident that the Catholic Church is coming to accept the basic doctrines of the Reformation. Pastor G. Richard Mollard, who covered Vatican II for the French Protestant journal called Reform, he said, while he regretted that a small number of Catholic bishops still confused truth itself with the teaching of the Catholic Church, he was generally optimistic. He affirmed that any Protestant present at the Council who might have felt tempted to modify any of the major axioms of the Reformation, what he called the Proclamation Majeure, would be lacking in intelligence or deaf for failing to see or hear that for more than 2 years, and doubtlessly for even longer, so many believing Catholics, priests and laymen had been probing the Scriptures, searching, praying and suffering to arrive at this moment, and by other ways at the point where they too accept these very same axioms. Pastor Richard Mollard is, like Archdeacon Pauli, confident that the process of renovation set in motion by the Council is more or less irreversible, quasi irreversible, he says. The influence exercised upon the Council by Protestants can best be illustrated by examining the evolution of the teaching of Vatican II concerning the Blessed Mother. I'll have to do this into 3 headings. 1, the separate schema on Our Lady. 2, the title Mediatrix of all graces. 3, the title Mother of the Church. The preparatory commission, about which I told you in my first lecture, decided unanimously to devote a separate schema to the Blessed Virgin Mary. After several changes of title, the schema was eventually called On the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mother of the Church. And if you think of it from a Protestant standpoint, to call Our Lady the Mother of the Church, is absolutely horrifying. Cardinal Ottaviani had hoped that the Council would discuss this short 6-page schema before the close of the first session, and the happy result, he believed, would have been that the Council Fathers, with the assistance of Our Lady, would conclude the first session in union and harmony. But the very fact that there was to be a separate schema devoted to Our Lady and the content of the schema aroused the displeasure of Protestants and their Catholic sympathisers. The ecumenically motivated Rhine Group programme was clear in its objectives. It was opposed to any separate schema being devoted to Our Lady. It was opposed to the title Mediatrix of All Graces and opposed to the title Mother of the Church. There had been legitimate differences of opinion among Catholic theologians before the Council, not on the fact that Our Lady had cooperated with our Lord in the economy of salvation, but on the nature and extent of that cooperation. An important school of thought favoured by Pope Pius XII had come to see Our Lady as cooperating in the acquisition of salvation and wished to see the magisterium define her as co-redemptrix and mediatrix of all graces. Another school favoured an approach emphasising her position as a member of the Church, like ourselves, differing from us not in the essence, but in the degree of her perfection. While the former view is incompatible with Protestantism, the latter has distinct ecumenical possibilities. The devotion of a separate schema to Our Lady was seen by Protestants as favouring the former view. Leading German Protestants had made it clear that Catholic teaching on Our Lady was a major impediment to reunion, that a separate schema on her, if approved, would erect a new wall of division, that if the Blessed Virgin Mary was even mentioned, they didn't even want her mentioned actually, but if she was even mentioned, it must be in the schema on the Church. And even that the Council should actually condemn what they termed the excesses of devotion to the Virgin Mary. They made it known that, if their requests were complied with, they would consider it a most satisfactory ecumenical gesture. The rejection of the plan for a separate schema became the first priority for the Fathers and Periti, who considered the ecumenical aspect of the Council as its most important dimension. I mentioned in my first lecture that a single theologian could impose his views on the whole Council, providing he could gain the approval of the German bishops. In the case of the separate schema, this is exactly what Karl Rahner did. He claimed that if a schema was accepted as it stood, unimaginable harm would result from the ecumenical point of view. All the success achieved in the field of ecumenism through the Council and in connection with the Council, he said, will be rendered worthless by the retention of the schema as it stands. He asked the Rhine Group bishops to declare openly that they could not accept the schema as it stood. The Rhine Group forces were accordingly deployed and went into action as soon as the topic was raised during the second session. Cardinal Frings felt that it would be most fitting to include everything pertaining to Our Lady in the schema on the Church, as among other things, such action would do much to foster dialogue with the separated Christians. A Croatian Peritus, Father Carolus Balic, was particularly active in combating the Rhine campaign, as were many bishops from the Latin countries. One of the Rhine arguments was that a separate schema would be taken as defining something new. But as a Brazilian Servite bishop, Giocondo Grotti, pointed out that there were separate schemas on a good number of topics, but no one claimed that anything new was being defined here. Does ecumenism consist in confessing or hiding the truth, he asked, and he continued, ought the Council to explain Catholic doctrine or the doctrine of our separated brethren? Hiding the truth hurts us both, and those separated from us. It hurts us because we appear to be hypocrites. It hurts those separated from us because it makes them appear weak and capable of being offended by the truth. Let the schemas be separated. Let us profess our faith openly. Let us be the teachers we are in the Church by teaching with clarity and not hiding what is true. When the vote came round, the Rhine Group won by a majority of only 17 votes, which was very, very narrow. Even Xavier Rin accepted that it would be difficult to describe it as a victory for the progressives. The Catholic Gazette in England reported that Our Lady was denied a separate schema with the feelings of non-Catholics in mind. A very interesting insight into the liberal mentality is the manner in which Xavier Rinn in the New Yorker describes the bishops who supported the unanimous conclusion of the preparatory commission that there should be a separate schema. He described their efforts as an extraordinary and intensive propaganda barrage on behalf of a separate schema on the Blessed Virgin Mary. But obviously it was the Rhine group which had behaved in a contentious manner by opposing what the preparatory commission had agreed upon. Protestant observers made no secret of their satisfaction at the relegation of Our Lady to the schema on the Church. Dr. McAfee Brown considers it to be an item of ecumenical importance. He explains that in this way the separate and independent extension of Marian theology was effectively checked. Dr. Moorman, leader of the Anglican delegation, could not refrain from expressing his relief at the final outcome when he considers that a mere handful of votes would have turned the thing the other way, with results which might have proved disastrous. Many of the observers, says Dr. Moorman, wondered if this was a sign that the Holy Spirit was at work. The second heading, which I mentioned, is the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mediatrix of All Graces. Archdeacon Pauly, who I've quoted several times, he feared that considered teaching on Our Lady, whether in a separate schema or the schema on the Church, might be used as a device for getting conciliar approval to one or two doctrines which the Pope had in mind. He continued, one English Roman Catholic bishop, who shall be allowed to remain anonymous, wrote in his diocesan leaflet, it is an open secret that the bishops are assembling with great hopes of new definitions to supplement the dogmas of the Catholic faith already revealed. It is my personal hope that the Holy Father will see fit to crown our love of our glorious and blessed Mother, Queen of Heaven and ever Virgin, with a definition of the dogmas Maria Mediatrix and Maria Fons Gratiae, which has ever been in the prayers and devotions of the faithful. The application of the title Mediatrix to Our Lady is by no means new and can be traced back to the Fathers of the Church. The title is attached to Mary in official church documents, including papal bulls and encyclicals, dating from Ineffabilis of Pope Pius IX in 1854. And it has also been introduced into the liturgy of the Church through the feast of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mediatrix of All Graces. Do they still have that feast, Father? Do you know? No? You think it doesn't?
You have a votive mass.
No. But in the 70 Missal, do they have it? No, so that solved that problem there. As I was saying, the Protestants, they weren't just opposed to a separate schema, they were very far from pleased with what it contained. And they didn't just want this schema to be relegated as it stood into the schema on the Church, but they wanted it considerably modified. Dr. Moorman, the Anglican, wrote, the schema produced in 1962 began well enough with a number of quotations from the Bible, indicating Mary's place and her cooperation in the divine plan. But it began to arouse suspicions in the mind of some of the observers when it began to speak of her as not only Mother of Jesus, the one and only divine mediator and redeemer, but also joined with him in carrying out the redemption of the human race. Suspicion grew when it went on to speak of her as administrator and dispenser of heavenly graces, and finally, mediatrix of all graces. Nor were they comforted by the appended note, which pointed out that these were not new phrases or titles, since each of them had appeared in some papal pronouncement, and that some of the expressions proposed by the maximalists had been deliberately omitted. As for the title of co-redemptrix, the note goes on to say that though used by Pope Pius X and Pius XI, it was left out of this schema so as not to offend the separated brethren, that no attempt was made to dissociate the council from this title or to throw any doubts upon his validity. But of course, he's not separated with all these concessions. Karl Rahner stated, quite correctly, that the acceptance of Our Lady as Mediatrix of All Graces was not a dogma of the faith, but simply a doctrine commonly held by all Catholics. And that's been the case with many doctrines which are equally true. And Our Lady was immaculately conceived before the definition of the Immaculate Conception, the same with the Assumption, the same with papal infallibility. But Karl Rahner was correct, there wasn't a dogma of the faith, and it still isn't. However, such doctrines can eventually be defined as dogmas binding upon the faithful. and a doctrine which is held universally, particularly when it is incorporated into the liturgy, may well be proclaimed as a dogma by the Pope. In this matter, however, the Rhine bishops were not as content to follow Rana's advice as they had been in the matter of the separate schema. They were not opposed to retaining the title mediatrix, although they were against mediatrix of all graces. This might surprise you. In a written intervention, Cardinal Spellman asked whether such titles used by supreme pontiffs could be passed over simply because they would be rather difficult for Protestants to understand. The task of an ecumenical council is to teach the members of the church rather than those outside it. So it's a very good statement by Cardinal Spellman. A good number of bishops from the Latin countries supported the inclusion of the title mediatrix, including 82 from Portugal, whose spokesman feared that its omission would generate scandal among the faithful, since the public was by this time aware that the matter had been discussed in the council hall. Liberal Catholics such as Cardinal Leger, Döpfner, Beyer and Alfring led the opposition to its inclusion. Cardinal Sunins differed from the Rhine group on this matter and criticised the text for minimising the importance of Our Lady, which, he said, is a tendency which today constitutes real danger. This intervention isn't actually surprising, as some people might imagine, because Cardinal Sunins had been noted for his devotion to the Mother of God, and he'd written an excellent book on Our Lady before the council. If any of you have seen any second-hand shops, these Faith and Fact books, he wrote the one on Our Lady. It's a beautiful book. For this one brief moment, writes Father Wilkins, Cardinal Sunins had the courage to break away from the party line and speak out his own mind. Eventually, a typical conciliar compromise was reached. The Liberals agreed not to oppose the inclusion of mediatrix if the Conservatives did not insist on the title Mother of the Church. And I think that the very idea of making compromises with regard to the honour due to Our Lady is distasteful. The thought of Catholic bishops doing things what you call a trade-off or plea bargaining or something, isn't it? In the United States you do these things. But to do this in a general council about Our Lady is very, very distasteful. But at least this was a setback for the extreme Liberals. But not too severe a setback, because they had managed to restrict the title to the one word mediatrix, and had managed to exclude the three words of all graces. And it was these three words which were particularly unacceptable to the Protestants. The title of the schema on Our Lady, which it had been decided should be added to the schema on the church, had been, I mentioned it to you earlier, the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mother of the Church. Contrary to what had been promised in the debate, the text of the separate schema was not simply transferred to the schema on the church, but, to quote Archbishop Mingo of Monreale in Italy, it had been absolutely and radically mutilated. See, that's the things they do in this negotiation. They said, just put it in the church as it stands, nothing will be changed. And then when the document appears, they find it's been absolutely mutilated. Among these mutilations, a Spanish bishop laid special stress on the change of the title to, on the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mother of God, in the mystery of Christ and the Church. He claimed that the revised text had reduced the doctrine of the Blessed Virgin Mary to the absolute minimum. Yet he said it had been stated in the council hall at the time of the vote that, by inserting the schema on the Virgin Mary into the schema on the Church, no diminution was intended or would be carried out. Cardinal Wyszynski, on behalf of 70 Polish bishops, asked the Pope to proclaim Our Lady Mother of the Church, as did 80 Spanish bishops, who pointed out that the title corresponded with pontifical documents issued by Popes Benedict XIV, John XXIII and Paul VI. They wished to have the title restored to the schema, where it had probably been inserted on the instructions of Pope John himself, but had then been removed by the Liberal-dominated theological conclusion on its own authority during its mutilation of the separate schema. In the end, as part of the compromise to enable the title mediatrix to remain, the new title for the schema was accepted, and those who had demanded the inclusion of the title Mother of the Church had to be content with the following passage in Article 53 of the Constitution on the Church. Now, just listen carefully to this. See, they got rid of the title Mother of the Church, and this is what they put in. You'll see it's the nuance here. Taught by the Holy Spirit, the Catholic Church honours her with filial affection and piety as a most beloved mother. However, the matter did not end here. By this time, although effective control of the Rhine group over the machinery of the council was almost absolute, organised opposition was beginning to emerge. In the third session, this resulted in the emergence of several organised groups, which, although never approaching the numerical strength of the Rhine Group's World Alliance, were able to alert many of the middle-of-the-road fathers as to what was happening, and thus to secure the correction of some of the more glaring deficiencies in the schemas. The schemas were, of course, now drafted by conciliar commissions, which, to all intents and purposes, were Rhine Group commissions. And I mentioned to you, I think in my first talk, the most effective of these opposition groups was the International Group of Fathers, of which Archbishop Lefebvre and Archbishop Sigo were leading members. The International Group of Fathers collected signatures for a petition to the Pope, begging him to proclaim Our Lady as Mother of the Church, just as they had done to try and get a condemnation of communism. Other petitions to the same effect had been received, notably one from all the bishops of Poland, so that's good for Poland there, every one of their bishops. They didn't have one dissenter on this, they all asked for this. And then, to the dismay of the Liberals, on Wednesday the 18th of November 1964, Pope Paul VI announced at a public audience, "We are happy to announce to you that we shall close this session of the Ecumenical Council by joyfully bestowing upon Our Lady the title due to her, Mother of the Church." The progressives, they had several other reverses in this week, and it's come to be known as the Black Week in their mythology. If you read any of these books by people like Xavier Rinn, Novak, Robert Kaiser, you'll all have a chapter or two on the Black Week. On Saturday, the 21st of November, on the last day of the session, the Pope stated in his closing address that, at his own desire in response to the wishes of many fathers and suggestions from various parts of the Catholic world, for the glory of the Virgin Mary and for our own consolation, we proclaim the Most Holy Mary as Mother of the Church. And the announcement was actually greeted with a standing ovation, and the Pope was interrupted by applause 7 times during his address. He also announced his intention of sending a golden rose to Fatima to entrust to the care of his Heavenly Mother the entire human family, with its problems and worries, with its lawful aspirations and ardent hopes. Father Wilkin considers that this was a partial reply to the petition from 510 heads of dioceses, archdioceses and patriarchates from 76 countries, begging the Pope to consecrate the whole world to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, as Our Lady of Fatima had requested. But of course what he didn't fulfill what Our Lady of Fatima had requested. In the face of opposition from Cardinal Bea and the bishops of France and Germany, Pope Paul had felt unable to take this step. But in fairness to Pope Paul, we have to say Pius XII failed to do it as well, because he saw the opposition was going to be great, even without any idea of a council in mind. Well, anyway, Pope Paul's action absolutely enraged the Liberals. Hans Kung expressed their reaction, and he denounced the promulgation of the misleading title Mater Ecclesiae against the expressed will of the council majority, which will arouse in non-Catholic Christendom great indignation and grave doubts as to the genuinely ecumenical sympathies of the Pope. Professor Oscar Kuhlmann, the leading Lutheran observer, he stated, "We cannot pass over in silence the disappointment we experienced at seeing the title Mediatrix given to Mary. The fact that the text on Mary, after so much discussion as to where it should be placed, should have finally become the concluding chapter of the schema on the Church, a decision which was intended to weaken Mariology, has in reality made it even stronger, because everything stated about the Church culminates, so to speak, in this chapter." Professor Coleman also complained that the many ceremonies which took place honouring Mary during the Council, together with the statements made about her by both Pope John and Pope Paul, meant that Mariology at this Council has in general been intensified to a degree which is not in keeping with the ecumenical tendencies of Protestantism and with a return to the Bible. Our expectations in this connection have not been fulfilled. What emerges from these facts is that Our Lady seems to have succeeded in turning the tables on the Liberals. The inclusion of the schema on her into the Constitution on the Church had an effect precisely the opposite to what was intended. Her title Mediatrix was included, and the title Mother of the Church was bestowed upon her in a far more solemn and public manner than would have been the case if the Liberals had not made such efforts to eliminate it from the text of the Constitution. So it might seem that what this lecture has shown is precisely the opposite of what it was intended to show. In other words, the extent of Protestant influence upon the Council. But this is not the case. The fact that the result of this influence turned out differently than intended does not alter the fact that so many of the fathers and their advisers were prepared to go to such lengths to play down or ignore aspects of the faith which they feared would be unpalatable to Protestants. A separate schema on Our Lady was rejected for ecumenical reasons. The title Mother of the Church was excluded from it for ecumenical reasons, and the words of all graces were removed from the title Mediatrix for ecumenical reasons. Dr. Moorman writes, in its final form, it was greeted by all but the most Protestant of the observers as a just and unexceptionable statement, which could not reasonably be accused of raising new barriers among the people of God. Certain titles are attributed to the Virgin: advocate, supporter, helper, mediator, but the two expressions most likely to cause offence, co-redemptrix and mediatrix of all graces, were carefully avoided. And Dr. Moorman also considers that the titles which are used are qualified within the Constitution sufficiently to safeguard them from misinterpretation. Dr. McAfee Brown, the American Presbyterian, is pleased to note that the chapter on Mary is deliberately couched in as biblical a framework as possible, replacing the string of papal quotations that had characterized the earlier draft, so that there might be an ecumenical meeting point with Protestants and Orthodox, both of whom affirm the authority of the Bible, but not of papal statements. However, despite its deficiencies, the chapter on Our Lady emerged as a very fine, if far from perfect, exposition of the role of Our Lady in the Church, and every Catholic could learn and benefit from reading it. Furthermore, in no sense whatsoever have developments in Marian doctrine, which many of the faithful hoped would emerge from the Council, been precluded, although there is little hope of their emergence in the present climate. I expect most of you know there's a huge battle going on now to try and have Our Lady proclaimed as mediatrix of all graces. But sadly, I'm sure the Pope believes in that doctrine, but that he's so withholding his approval, probably for ecumenical reasons. The attitude to Our Lady manifested by the Liberals during the Council has come to be the hallmark of those engaged in contemporary ecumenism. When Catholic doctrine is to be explained today, the prime criterion isn't, is this what the Church teaches, but will this offend Protestants? And it would be dishonest to try and gloss over the fact that Pope Paul VI, more than any single individual, must accept responsibility for the disastrous effects of false ecumenism upon the Church. When the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. A.M. Ramsay, visited Rome, Paul VI treated him as if he really were an archbishop rather than a member of a Protestant sect, which, where its own ordinal has been relied upon, has neither priests nor bishops. The Pope presented Dr. Ramsay with his own episcopal ring, invited this Protestant layman to join him in blessing the crowds in St. Peter's Square, giving a clear impression, not least to Dr. Ramsay himself, that he really was an archbishop and the primate of all England and successor to St. Augustine of Canterbury. More seriously, the Pope referred to the Church of England as a sister church, a phrase which has been seized upon joyfully, not simply by Anglicans, but by Catholic ecumeniacs. And this phrase is absolutely indefensible when it's applied to Protestants. The term church, it can be used in several different senses. There's the one holy Catholic Apostolic Church, to which we have the good fortune to belong, but it's made up of diocesan churches or dioceses. Every diocese is a church. I belong to the Church of Southwark, where David White's going soon to see the new Globe Theatre. Southwark is called the other side of the river in London, and they were allowed to have plays there, but not on what you'd call the London side now. So I'm in the Church of Southwark. John Rowe belongs to the Church of New York, and today we're all present in the Church of Brescia. They're all sister churches. And the 5 great patriarchates have also been referred to as sister churches, but the popes would never accept that all the patriarchs were of equal status. I'm pleased to say on the 30th of June last year, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith condemned Catholics who describe the Anglican Communion as a sister church or any other Protestant dominations, which is so bearing in mind, Paul VI said the Church of England was a sister church, and now the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith has condemned anyone who said that. It helps us to remember what Dietrich von Hildebrand always insisted upon, which is not every point of view expressed by the Pope is endowed with infallible authority. Well, I'm just coming to the end. I've gone over the time, unfortunately, but it can be stopped anywhere. As I said to you in my first talk, Archbishop Lefebvre complained that there were time bombs in the conciliar texts, and by this he meant ambiguous phrases inserted into the documents by the periti, the experts, which could be exploded after Vatican II in a manner that the Council Fathers would never have envisioned. In my first lecture, I quoted Cardinal Heenan's observation that a determined group could wear down opposition and produce a formula patient of both an orthodox and modernistic interpretation. Well, the time available doesn't allow me to go into a number of these time bombs, so I'll just give one example. The original draft of the dogmatic constitution on the Church stated that the Church existing on earth as a structured society is the Catholic Church. This was changed to the Church constituted and organized in the world as a society subsists in the Catholic Church. And you see, the fact that they changed it from is to subsists, that puts a lot more importance on this change. If it had subsist from the beginning, it wouldn't have been so bad. But they took out is, which was used by Pius XII in his encyclical on the mystical body of Christ, and put in subsist. Now, what does subsist mean? And why was the change made? Some Orthodox commentators, doubtless in all sincerity, claim that is and subsist mean the same thing. So we're therefore entitled to ask, if they mean the same thing, then why on earth did they change it? Father Gregory Baum, who was a Jewish convert who eventually left the priest and got married, he interpreted the word subsists in precisely the modernistic aspect which Cardinal Heenan said was possible. Baum, he writes, instead of simply identifying the Church of Christ with the Catholic Church, the Constitution rather says more carefully that the Church of Christ subsists in the Catholic Church, but at the same time, without losing its historical and incarnational character, transcends it. Now Anglicans are able to quote Gregory Baum with very great approval, and one Anglican observer said the Council has therefore admitted that the Church of Christ is something bigger than the Roman Catholic Church. Now, quite recently, the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith has produced an official interpretation of the meaning of subsist within the Constitution, which shows that the word can be used in a perfectly orthodox manner. And now that is the official interpretation of it, and we're bound to accept that interpretation. But Catholic ecumeniacs and Protestants would just ignore this authoritative interpretation of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and the harm done by the substitution of subsist phrase is going to continue. I'm finally at the end. I've mentioned Professor Oscar Cullmann several times, and there's no doubt that he was one of the most distinguished scholars, probably the most distinguished scholar among all the Protestant observers at the Council. And he was a man of such stature and integrity that he earned the respect of Catholics of every shade of opinion. And it would be a very, very rash commentator indeed who dismissed his opinion on the significance of the Council text. And once again, it's very interesting to see the manner in which his opinion concurs with that about Archbishop Lefebvre. This is what Professor Coleman says. The definitive texts are, for the most part, compromise texts, textes de compromis. On far too many occasions, they juxtapose opposing viewpoints without establishing any genuine internal link between them. Thus, every affirmation of the power of the bishops is accompanied in a manner which is almost tedious by an insistence upon the authority of the Pope. There is, nonetheless, as the basis of all these documents, an intention of renewal from which reforms can emerge after the Council. This is the reason why, even while accepting that these are compromised texts, I do not share the pessimism of those who subscribe to the slogan that nothing will come out of the Council. Listen to this last sentence. All the texts are formulated in such a manner that no door is closed, and that they will not present any future obstacle to discussions among Catholics or dialogue with non-Catholics, as was the case with the dogmatic decisions of previous councils. And my very, very last word will be, I'd like to quote Pope Pius XII. One of the Protestant observers, a Dr. Skysgard, said, "We found ourselves meeting together at the beginning of a road whose end only God knows." The situation which developed during Vatican II and the inevitable consequences for the Church when this situation was allowed to develop after the Council were foreseen and described by Pope Pius XII in his encyclical Humani Generis. This is what Pope Pius XII warned. A policy of appeasement could certainly end in unity, but the world, although the world may indeed be united, it will be united only in a common ruin. Which I think if we look around us, we'll see that Pius XII was right. And I apologise. I'll rush upstairs now and see if I can cut my next talk down a bit to make up for keeping you too long now.